In the scorched summer of 1858, a silence fell over the Louisiana sugar lands that was deeper and more profound than the usual oppressive quiet of the cane fields. It was a silence born of an event so singular and shocking that it defied the natural order of things, an order built on the absolute and unquestionable authority of men like Marcus Thorne. On the morning of August the 12th, Thorne, the master of Belle Rêve plantation, a man whose will was as unbending as the ancient oaks that shaded his drive, was found dead in his study alongside his overseer, a brute named Caleb Finch. The official report, penned by a county physician sweating in his wool coat and eager to escape the miasma of the place, cited concurrent and catastrophic cerebral hemorrhages, a tragic, if medically improbable, coincidence. But what really happened in the grand, suffocating house at Belle Rêve, as the cicadas sang their droning hymn to the humidity and the Spanish moss hung from the trees like funeral shrouds, was a story the official record would never dare to tell. It was a story not of chance, but of a justice so precise, and so long in the coming that it had the quality of a dark and patient miracle. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our explorations into the forgotten corners of history. And let us know in the comments what state or country you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Belle Rêve was not a place of beautiful dreams, despite its name. It was a kingdom carved from the sweltering Louisiana swamp, a monument to human avarice built on a foundation of human misery. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of boiling sugar cane, the metallic tang of sweat, and the ever-present humidity that clung to the skin like a wet shroud. The plantation sprawled over 2,000 acres of cleared swampland, a vibrant green scar on the earth, where hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children toiled under a sun that offered no mercy. Their lives were governed by the ringing of a bell and the crack of a whip, a rhythm of relentless labor that began before dawn and ended long after dusk. The system was one of perfect, calculated cruelty, designed not merely to extract labor but to extinguish the spirit. Every aspect of life, from the meager rations of cornmeal and salt pork to the flimsy cypress-board cabins arranged in neat, stark rows, was a reminder of their status as property, as tools to be used until they broke. This system was the primary antagonist, a vast and impersonal machine of suffering, but it had a face and a name. Marcus Thorne was the architect and absolute monarch of this domain. He was a man of medium height, with a frame that had grown stout with the comforts his cruelty afforded him. His hair was the color of pewter, and his face was a mask of stern, patrician control. But it was his eyes that truly defined him. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they possessed a chilling clarity. They did not see people. They saw assets, liabilities, calculations on a ledger. He viewed sentiment as a weakness and compassion as a fatal flaw in the management of what he referred to as his stock. He was not a man given to fits of rage. His violence was methodical, a tool applied with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon. A flogging was not a punishment born of anger, but a calculated measure to ensure productivity. A family separation was not a tragedy, but a sound business decision. He was a pillar of his community, a respected member of the Planters' Benevolent Association, a secret council of the region's most powerful landowners who met to set prices, share methods of control, and ensure that the law remained a distant and irrelevant abstraction. They were kings in their own right, and their word was the only law that mattered. Within this oppressive world lived his daughter, Elira Thorne. To any observer, she was a perfect extension of her father's world, quiet, dutiful, and ornamental. With her pale skin, dark hair coiled in a severe but fashionable knot, and the perpetually downcast eyes of a well-bred Southern lady, she seemed to drift through the grand house like a ghost. She was her father's property as surely as the people in the fields, her value determined by her purity and the advantageous marriage she could secure. Marcus had seen to her education, not out of any belief in female intellect, but because a literate and accomplished daughter was another reflection of his own status. He did not know that in teaching her to read, he had given her the key to a world beyond Belle Rêve, a world of ideas and possibilities he could not control. He was also unaware of her second, secret education. As a lonely child, left to her own devices after her mother's early death, Alara had been quietly cared for by an old enslaved woman named Mama Toussaint, the plantation's healer and midwife. From Mama Toussaint, Alara learned the language of the swamp, the properties of roots and leaves, which plants could cure a fever, which could ease a pain, and which, if prepared with care, could silently and untraceably stop a heart. This knowledge, gathered in secret moments in the herb garden behind the kitchens, was a power her father could never comprehend. She cultivated a facade of fragile subservience, a mask of passive obedience that concealed a mind as sharp and calculating as his own. The power dynamic between them was absolute and suffocating. Marcus Thorne controlled every aspect of his daughter's existence. He dictated her wardrobe, vetted her reading material, and managed her social interactions with the unyielding hand of a despot. She was a pawn in his dynastic ambitions, a beautiful piece to be played in the great game of land and legacy. He would often lecture her in his study, the room smelling of old leather and his favorite brandy, his voice a low, insistent drone. "A woman's mind is a delicate thing, Alara," he would say, looking not at her but through her, at the portrait of his own stern-faced father on the wall. "It is not built for the burdens of commerce or the complexities of governance. It is a vessel for grace, piety, and, above all, obedience. Your duty is to your family name, to the preservation of our way of life." For Alara, the grand house was not a home but a gilded cage. The enslaved people in the fields were bound by iron chains. She was bound by invisible chains of custom, law, and filial duty. Yet, in the quiet observation of her prison, she had learned its every secret, its every weakness. She saw the way her father's arrogance made him careless, the way his belief in his own invincibility made him predictable. She watched, she listened, and she waited, though for many years she did not know what she was waiting for. The catalyst, when it came, was not a grand, philosophical awakening, but the oldest and most human of forces, love. His name was Samuel. He was a blacksmith, a man whose skill with fire and iron was a form of artistry. Unlike the field hands broken by the sun and the hoe, Samuel carried himself with a quiet, unyielding dignity. He was tall and strong, his muscles forged by the heat of his work, but his power was in his stillness. He was one of the few on the plantation who could read, a secret he guarded as carefully as his life. He and Alara had grown up in the strange, segregated intimacy of plantation life, their worlds parallel but forbidden to intersect. Their connection began in stolen moments, a shared look across the yard, a book secretly passed from her hand to his in the dim light of the stables, a whispered conversation by the back fence under the cover of darkness. Their love was a dangerous, impossible thing, a rebellion in a world that denied his very humanity. For Alara, Samuel was not an escape, he was a mirror. In his eyes, she was not an ornament or a possession, but a person. In his presence, she could shed the suffocating mask of the planter's daughter and breathe. Their relationship was a secret garden cultivated in the heart of a wasteland, a fragile bloom of hope in a world of despair. The discovery was as brutal and inevitable as a summer storm. Marcus Thorne, for all his methodical thinking, possessed the base instincts of a predator, and he sensed the shift in his daughter's demeanor. He had Caleb Finch, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his sycophantic loyalty, watch her. One evening, Finch observed a fleeting, tender touch between Alara and Samuel near the smokehouse. He reported it to his master immediately. Marcus did not confront Alara with rage. His approach was far more terrifying. He summoned her to his study the next morning. The air was still and cool, the sunlight slanting through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, a ledger open before him. He did not ask her to sit. "I have made 2 decisions that concern you," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "First, I have accepted an offer for the blacksmith Samuel. He is a prime specimen, and the Abernathy plantation in the Mississippi Delta has made a generous bid. He will be transported next month. It is a place, I am told, from which no one ever returns. He paused, letting the words settle in the silent room. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, a cold dread creeping through her veins. It was a death sentence. He was not finished. He dipped his pen in the inkwell and made a neat notation in his ledger before continuing, his gaze still fixed on the page. Second, I have concluded the arrangements for your marriage. You will be wed to Mr. Julian Croft of Three Rivers Parish. The union will consolidate our holdings and secure our family's influence for a generation. Julian Croft. The name was a venomous whisper among the women of her class. He was a man in his late 50s, twice a widower under suspicious circumstances, a creature of appetites as vast as his lands. The thought of his touch was a violation that made her skin crawl. Her father had not just sentenced her love to death, he had sentenced her to a living one. He finally looked up, his pale eyes pinning her in place. You have been indulging in a dangerous sentimentality, Elara. It is a disease of the spirit. I am providing the cure. You will learn that love is a luxury, and duty is the currency of our world. You are dismissed. He turned back to his ledger, the interview concluded. The finality of it was absolute. She was nothing. A piece of property to be bartered, her heart and her future lines on a balance sheet. In that moment, something inside Elara Thorne broke. Or perhaps, it was not broken but forged. The years of silent observation, of suppressed rage, of carefully cultivated knowledge, all coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of resolve. She walked from the study in a daze, her body moving with the practiced grace of a lifetime of obedience, but her mind was a whirlwind of cold, clear fury. She went to her room, the most feminine and confining space in the house, with its floral wallpaper and delicate furniture, and for the first time, she saw it as a command center. The initial, frantic thoughts of escape, of running away with Samuel into the swamps, to be hunted by dogs and men, faded quickly. It was a child's fantasy. They would never be free. The system her father represented would hound them to the ends of the earth. There was no running from Marcus Thorne. The only way to be free of the monster was to destroy him. Not just him, but the power he wielded. It was not enough to save Samuel. It was not enough to save herself. She had to excise the cancer at its root. She sat before her vanity mirror and looked at her own reflection, at the pale, frightened face of the planter's daughter. And for the first time, she saw the face of a killer looking back. Her resolve solidified, no longer a desperate reaction but a conscious, chilling choice. She would not be the victim in this story. She would be the reckoning. The period that followed was a masterclass in deception. Elara transformed her grief into a performance of perfect, heartbreaking submission. She wept, she pleaded with a convincing hysteria, and then, as if her spirit were finally broken, she accepted her fate. She began the preparations for her wedding to Julian Croft with a quiet, tragic resignation that earned her the pity of the house staff and the smug satisfaction of her father. He saw her quiet industry as proof of his method's success. He had excised the romantic foolishness and restored his daughter to her proper, dutiful state. He was blind to the truth. Every moment of those weeks was an act of meticulous, patient intelligence gathering. She became a shadow in her own home, her supposed sorrow granting her a new kind of invisibility. She observed her father's habits with a new, predatory focus. She noted that he and Caleb Finch took a glass of brandy together in his study every night at precisely 9 o'clock, a ritual to discuss the day's profits and problems. She noted the specific, expensive brand of French brandy he favored, kept in a locked cabinet to which only he had the key. She noted that on the second Tuesday of every month, he hosted the meeting of the Planters' Benevolent Association, a night when he and his inner circle would drink more heavily, their voices growing louder and their boasts more monstrous as the hours wore on. While her hands were busy with needlepoint, stitching her bridal trousseau, her mind was a whirlwind of chemical equations and botanical knowledge. She feigned an interest in gardening, a suitably feminine pastime, spending hours in the humid gardens behind the main house. Her father, seeing this as a sign of her return to domesticity, allowed it. He did not know she was not tending roses, but cultivating her arsenal. She sought out the plants Mama Toussaint had shown her years ago, hidden in the shaded, overgrown corners of the property. There was the foxglove, beautiful and deadly, a source of digitalis that could mimic a failing heart. There was the water hemlock, with its delicate white flowers, its roots containing a cytotoxin that could induce seizures and respiratory collapse. But these were too crude, too obvious. They left traces, signs of struggle. She needed something more elegant, more subtle. Something that would speak not of murder, but of fate. She found it in a shaded, damp patch near the edge of the swamp, a cluster of seemingly innocuous vines with dark, glossy berries. It was a plant the local tribes called the silent sleep, Gelsemium sempervirens. Mama Toussaint had warned her of it above all others. Its alkaloid poison, gelsamine, was a powerful paralytic. In the right dose, it would induce muscle weakness, drooping eyelids, difficulty swallowing, and finally, respiratory arrest. The victim would remain conscious, aware, trapped inside a body that was shutting down. It was a poison that killed without a mark, mimicking the symptoms of a stroke or a sudden, overwhelming paralysis. It was the perfect weapon. Her resolve was tested and hardened daily. The house, once a familiar prison, now felt like a hunting ground, and she was the predator learning her prey. One afternoon, she overheard her father discussing the Abernathy plantation with a visitor. "Their methods are efficient," he said with a cold smile. "They work a man to death in 5 years, but the sugar yield is the highest in the territory. A worthy investment." He was speaking of Samuel's fate, of a human life, as a calculation of profit and loss. The casual cruelty of his words stoked the cold fire in her soul. Another evening, from the shadows of the upstairs veranda, she watched as Caleb Finch administered a brutal whipping to a young field hand who had collapsed from heat exhaustion. Her father stood by, watching with his arms crossed, his expression one of detached analysis. "A little more to the left, Mr. Finch," he instructed calmly. "We must make the lesson memorable, but not damage the muscle tissue. He is still valuable property." In these moments, any lingering trace of doubt, any whisper of filial piety, was burned away. These were not men. They were monsters cloaked in the finery of civilization, and she was the instrument of their overdue judgment. Her only connection to the outside world of her plan was Samuel. Communication was fraught with peril. A single misstep would mean his death and her ruin. They revived an old system from the early days of their secret friendship. In the hollow of a lightning-scarred cypress tree at the edge of the woods, they left messages for one another. Her notes, written in a tiny, precise script on scraps of paper, were carefully worded instructions, disguised as verses of scripture or lines of poetry they had once shared. His replies were often just a single, carved mark on a piece of wood, a confirmation that he understood. Her most critical message was a warning. "The night of the full moon, be watchful but do nothing. Stay in your cabin. No matter what you hear, do not emerge." Trust me, it was a terrible risk, demanding a faith from him that defied logic. He was a man with every reason to distrust the world, especially the world of the white masters. But he did trust her. His reply was a small, smoothly carved wooden bird, a symbol of freedom they had long used. It was his assent. He would wait. His patience, his trust in her, became the final, crucial component of her plan. The ally and the complication were one and the same. His life was the ticking clock, the sail to Abernathy the deadline that gave her courage its sharp and terrible edge. She was not just fighting for an abstract ideal of justice, she was fighting for a future, for a life, for the man who was the only humanizing force in her desolate world. The second Tuesday of August arrived with a suffocating blanket of heat. The sky was a hazy, bruised purple, promising a thunderstorm that refused to break. It was the night of the planters' meeting. The air in the house was thick with anticipation, the servants rushing to prepare for the arrival of the local gentry. For Alara, the day passed in a state of heightened, almost surreal calm. She moved through her tasks with a placid grace, her outward demeanor a perfect mask for the storm raging within. She had spent the previous days carefully processing the gelsemium roots, distilling a small, potent quantity of the clear, tasteless liquid. The vial was now hidden in a secret compartment in her jewelry box, a single drop of death amidst the pearls and lace. The plan was simple, relying on her father's arrogance and the unvarying nature of his routines. Her moment would come late in the evening, after the main dinner, when the men retired to her father's study for their private council, their brandy, and their cigars. As dusk fell, the carriages began to arrive, crunching up the gravel drive. Elara stood beside her father on the veranda, playing the part of the gracious hostess. She greeted men like Julian Croft, her vile fiancé, with a polite curtsy, her eyes downcast, enduring his leering gaze and the moist touch of his hand. She smiled at men whose names were whispered in fear in the slave quarters, men who had built empires on the backs of broken people. She saw them not as powerful figures, but as cattle being led to the abattoir. The dinner was an ordeal of false civility. The men talked of cotton prices, of troublesome runaways, and of the growing abolitionist sentiment in the North, speaking of it as one might speak of a pestilence. Elara ate little, her stomach a tight knot of nerves and resolve. After the meal, as was custom, she and the other ladies retired to the parlor, while the men, her father and his 5 closest associates, including Croft and Caleb Finch, made their way to the study. This was the moment. With a quiet excuse of a headache, Elara slipped away from the parlor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the hall. She moved with a practiced quietness, her slippers making no sound on the polished floors. She reached the study. The door was closed. From within, she could hear the low murmur of their voices, the clink of glasses. Her access point was the small butler's pantry adjacent to the study, where the decanters and glasses were kept. A trusted house slave, an elderly woman named Rose who had known Elara since birth and harbored a deep, silent hatred for Marcus Thorne, had been instructed to leave the pantry unattended for a few minutes, a small act of solidarity that required no explanation. Elara slipped inside. The room was dark, smelling of polish and spirits. There on the silver tray was the crystal decanter of her father's favorite brandy, waiting to be taken in. Her hands, surprisingly, were steady. She uncorked the vial. She let a carefully measured amount of the clear liquid drip into the amber brandy, counting the drops with methodical precision. She swirled the decanter gently, watching the poison dissolve, becoming one with the spirit. It was done. She replaced the stopper, her movements economical and precise. She placed the vial back in her pocket and slipped out of the pantry as silently as she had entered. She walked back towards the parlor, her composure absolute. In her mind, she was no longer just a daughter or a victim. She was an executioner. Inside the study, Marcus Thorne poured the brandy for his guests. The room was paneled in dark cypress, the air thick with cigar smoke. They were celebrating a recent victory, the crushing of a nascent slave rebellion on a neighboring plantation. They toasted their own foresight, their own strength. "To order," Marcus said, raising his glass. "The foundation of our prosperity." The others echoed the toast. Croft, Finch, and the 3 other powerful planters drank deeply. The trap was sprung. The poison was tasteless, undetectable. For several minutes, their conversation continued unabated. Then Caleb Finch, in the middle of a boastful story, faltered. His words slurred. He blinked, a look of confusion on his brutish face, and tried to raise his glass again, but his arm felt impossibly heavy. He dropped the glass, which shattered on the floor. Across the room, Julian Croft let out a strangled gasp. He tried to stand, but his legs would not obey him. A look of pure, animal terror filled his eyes as he slid from his chair to the floor, his body limp. One by one, the poison took them. They collapsed in their chairs or onto the thick aubusson carpet, their minds fully alert, their eyes wide with a horror they could not articulate. They were trapped, prisoners in their own bodies, the ultimate loss of control for men who had lived their entire lives in absolute command. Marcus Thorne was the last to succumb. He fought it, his immense will battling the chemical tide. He managed a single, guttural sound as he tried to push himself up from his desk, his hand clawing at the polished wood, before he too slumped forward, his head hitting the ledger with a soft thud. He was paralyzed, his pale blue eyes staring, unblinking, at the ceiling. He could see. He could hear. And he was utterly, completely helpless. The door to the study opened. Elara stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. The storm had finally broken outside, and a flash of lightning illuminated the macabre tableau, 6 powerful men, rendered as helpless as newborns. She moved with an unnerving calm, pulling a straight-backed chair from against the wall and placing it in the center of the room, directly in her father's line of sight. She sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the drumming of the rain against the windows, and the ragged, shallow breathing of the paralyzed men. "Good evening, father," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the demure softness he was accustomed to. It was the voice of a stranger. "Gentlemen, I trust the brandy was to your liking." She looked from one pair of terrified eyes to the next, a cold, assessing gaze. "I believe we have some matters to discuss. A final accounting, you might say." She began with her father. "You speak often of ledgers and accounts," she said, her voice a low, chilling monotone. "Let us balance yours. I will not speak of my mother, whom you drove to an early grave with your coldness. I will speak of those whose names you never bothered to learn." She leaned forward slightly. "Let us start with Joshua, the stable boy you had whipped to death for startling your horse. He was 12. His mother, Hester, threw herself in the bayou 2 weeks later. You marked it down as a financial loss of 2 assets. I remember his name." A flicker of rage and disbelief showed in Marcus Thorne's eyes, the only part of him that could still move. Elara continued, her recitation a litany of forgotten horrors. "And there was Chloe, sold south to pay for my new piano. You tore her from her husband and her 2 small children. You told me the music she made as she was dragged away was a lesson in the price of beauty. I remember her name." She turned her gaze to Caleb Finch, whose eyes were wide with panic. "Mr. Finch, you enjoyed your work. You took pleasure in it. You were the one who held the branding iron to the face of the girl named Sarah for the crime of learning to read. You said it would teach the others that knowledge was a dangerous thing for their kind. I remember her name." She moved methodically around the room, addressing each man in turn, her memory a perfect, cold archive of their sins. To one, she recounted the story of a family he had gambled away in a card game. To another, she described the breeding program he boasted of, a systematic campaign of rape to increase his human stock. She spoke of children taken from mothers, husbands from wives, of casual cruelties and monstrous policies discussed over brandy and cigars in this very room. She was giving voice to the silent, unrecorded suffering that permeated the very soil of Belle Rêve. "You built your kingdom on the bones of people whose only crime was to be born," she said, her voice rising slightly with a controlled, righteous fury. "You called it order. You called it civilization. You called it God's will. But it was nothing but theft on a grand scale. Theft of life, of labor, of family, of hope." She stood and walked over to Julian Croft, her intended husband, who lay helpless on the floor, his face a mask of terror. She looked down at him with utter contempt. "And you? You thought to purchase me, to add me to your collection of broken things. You would have found me a most disappointing acquisition." Finally, she returned to her father. The storm outside raged, a fitting symphony for the judgment taking place within the study. "You sought to cure me of sentiment," she said, her voice dropping once more to a near whisper. "But you have succeeded only in teaching me the true meaning of justice. The justice of the powerless. It is not swift. It is not merciful. It is patient. It is methodical. And it is absolute." She looked at the paralyzed man who had sired her, the man who had been a god in her world, now reduced to a pair of terrified, blinking eyes. "My final lesson for you is this: the nature of helplessness. This feeling, this absolute terror of being unable to move, to speak, to fight back as your fate is decided for you. This is the world you created for others. I wanted you to experience it. Just for a moment. Before the end. She then produced a second, smaller vial from her pocket. Do not worry, Father. I will not leave you to suffer. She walked behind his chair, out of his line of sight. She uncorked the vial and poured its contents, a concentrated, lethal dose of the poison, into the remainder of his brandy in the glass on his desk. She then moved to the front of the desk, lifted the glass with a steady hand, and gently, almost tenderly, tilted it to his lips. He could not resist. The liquid trickled into his mouth. She did the same for the others, a priestess administering a final, dark sacrament. The end came quickly. The shallow breathing of the men ceased, one by one. The ticking of the clocks seemed to grow louder in the sudden, profound silence. It was over. Elara did not linger. Her methodical calm remained unbroken. She moved through the room with purpose, creating the scene of a tragic accident. She overturned Finch's chair, as if he had collapsed violently. She nudged a heavy silver letter opener near Croft's hand. Finally, she took her father's limp arm and knocked his brandy glass from the desk, sending it shattering onto the floor beside Finch's. The mingled scent of brandy and death hung in the air. She took one last look at the carnage, at the architects of so much misery now lying inert and insignificant. There was no triumph in her heart, only a vast, cold emptiness. She had done what was necessary. She opened the study door, took a deep, shuddering breath, and composed her face into a mask of innocent concern. Then she walked calmly into the main hall, towards the sound of the ladies' chatter in the parlor, preparing to raise the alarm. Her scream was a work of art. It was not the shriek of a common hysteric, but the horrified, strangled cry of a gently bred woman confronting an unspeakable scene. It sliced through the polite murmur of the parlor and the drone of the rain. The house erupted into chaos. Servants came running, the ladies from the parlor spilled into the hall, their faces pale with alarm. Elara, pointing a trembling finger towards the study, collapsed into the arms of Rose, the elderly house slave, her body racked with perfectly feigned sobs. The first men to enter the study, guests who had not been part of the inner circle, stopped dead in the doorway, their faces slack with disbelief and horror. The scene was one of inexplicable, simultaneous death. 6 powerful men, pillars of their community, struck down in an instant. Dr. Beaumont arrived within the hour, a portly, well-meaning man whose medical knowledge was 20 years out of date. He bustled into the study, his bag clutched in his hand, his face beaded with sweat from the ride through the storm. He examined the bodies one by one, peering into their unseeing eyes, feeling for pulses that were long gone. He was baffled. There were no signs of violence, no marks of struggle, save for the overturned chairs and shattered glasses, which suggested a sudden, violent convulsion. He noted the purplish tinge to their skin, a sign of asphyxia, and the slight drooping of their eyelids. He questioned a distraught and weeping Elara, who recounted how she had gone to call her father and found them just as they were. It was like they were all struck by lightning at once. She stammered through her tears. Dr. Beaumont, faced with a phenomenon beyond his comprehension and surrounded by the panicked and powerful families of the deceased, fell back on the most plausible, if improbable, diagnosis. Apoplexy, he declared, his voice filled with a gravity that masked his own uncertainty. A series of catastrophic, simultaneous strokes. I have never seen the like. The richness of the meal, the heat of the night, their age. It must have been a perfect storm of factors. A medical tragedy of unparalleled proportions. The local sheriff, a man named Prendergast whose position depended entirely on the goodwill of the planter class, arrived the next morning. He conducted a perfunctory investigation that was little more than a formality. He interviewed the servants, who knew nothing. He interviewed the ladies, who had been in the parlor. He interviewed Dr. Beaumont, who confidently repeated his diagnosis. And he interviewed the grieving daughter, Elara, whose performance of devastated innocence was flawless. Prendergast, a man not inclined to look for trouble, especially when it involved the most influential men in the parish, saw no reason to doubt the doctor's conclusion. The idea of foul play, of poison, was unthinkable. Who would dare? And how could it be done to 6 men at once? The very audacity of such a crime placed it beyond the realm of his imagination. He wrote his report, officially closing the case. The deaths at Belle Rêve were ruled a tragic act of God. The remaining members of the Planters' Benevolent Association, while privately unnerved by the sheer impossibility of the event, publicly closed ranks. They understood the danger of allowing any other narrative to take root. A story of a mysterious, untraceable death of 6 powerful masters could put ideas into the heads of their own enslaved populations. For the sake of order, the official story had to be the only story. The truth was buried, quickly and efficiently, under a mountain of platitudes and public mourning. In the chaotic weeks that followed, as lawyers and distant relatives descended upon Belle Rêve like vultures, Elara moved with a quiet, steely purpose. As the sole heir, she held temporary authority over the estate. Her first and most critical act was to secure Samuel's freedom. The sale to the Abernathy plantation was still on the books, a ticking clock that had not stopped with her father's death. She could not simply free him. Manumission was a legally complex and socially inflammatory act. So, she arranged a different kind of sale. Through a series of carefully coded letters, she had made contact with a Quaker merchant in New Orleans, a known abolitionist who operated a clandestine branch of the Underground Railroad. Using a cache of gold her father had kept hidden in his study, a fund for emergencies, she sold Samuel to the Quaker for an exorbitant price. The bill of sale was legal and binding. But the transaction was a fiction, a piece of paper to grant him passage. On a moonless night, Samuel was taken from his cabin, not in chains, but by a quiet guide who led him to a waiting skiff on the bayou. His journey to the north, to a new life as a free man, had begun. Elara watched from her window as the small boat disappeared into the darkness. A pang of profound loss mingled with the fierce, quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. With Samuel safe, Elara turned her attention to her own fate. She summarily broke her engagement to the late Julian Croft, an act that scandalized the parish but could not be contested. She inherited Belle Rêve and all its holdings, becoming, overnight, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Louisiana. She was no longer a pawn, she was a queen on a dark and complicated chessboard. Her rule over the plantation was a strange and unsettling thing for those who watched her. She did not immediately dismantle the brutal system her father had perfected. To do so would have been to invite suspicion and ruin. Instead, she began a process of subtle, almost imperceptible change. The overseer she hired was a stern but not a cruel man. The lash was still a tool of enforcement, but its use became rare. Rations were improved. Families, where possible, were kept together. She established a small infirmary, using her knowledge of herbs to treat the sick. To the outside world, she was seen as a woman overwhelmed by her inheritance, perhaps too soft-hearted for the business of planting. To the enslaved people of Belle Rêve, she was an enigma. They knew, on some deep, instinctual level, that the night of judgment had been her doing. They watched her with a mixture of fear, awe, and a nascent, fragile hope. She had freed them from a tyrant, but they were still in chains. Her fate, and theirs, remained deeply and dangerously ambiguous. She was a reformer trapped within the very system she had sought to break, a benevolent dictator ruling over a kingdom of misery she could not, or would not, fully dismantle. The long-term effects of that stormy August night rippled out from Belle Rêve in slow, widening circles. The sudden, inexplicable death of 6 of the region's most powerful men sent a deep and lasting chill through the planter class. Their belief in their own invulnerability, their divine right to rule, was shaken to its core. The official story of a medical anomaly was what they clung to in public, but in private, a dark paranoia took root. They looked at their food with suspicion. They eyed their house slaves with a new, uncertain fear. The brutal certainty that had governed their world was fractured. The Planters' Benevolent Association, deprived of its most ruthless leaders, lost its iron grip. On neighboring plantations, the most extreme forms of cruelty abetted, not out of a newfound morality, but out of a primal, superstitious fear of a swift and silent retribution. The invisible architecture of terror that upheld the institution of slavery had developed a crack, and fear, for the first time, was flowing in the opposite direction. Among the enslaved communities of Louisiana, another story was told. It was not the story found in the parish records or the society pages of the New Orleans newspapers. It was a story whispered in the dark of the cabins, sung in the coded language of the spirituals, and passed down from one generation to the next. They called it the Night of Judgment, or sometimes, the Ghost Jasmine Reckoning. In this telling, the master of Belle Rêve and his cruelest allies had been struck down not by a stroke, but by the spirits of the ancestors they had wronged. They said the swamp itself had risen up to claim them. And at the center of the legend was the quiet, pale daughter, Miss Alara. She was not a murderer, but an avenging angel, a conduit for a justice that the white man's God had forgotten to deliver. Her story became a powerful symbol of resistance, a testament to the fact that even the most powerful master was mortal, that the most oppressive system had its weaknesses. It was a story that said, "They are not gods. They can be broken." This legend, this piece of oral history, became a spark of hope in the suffocating darkness, a quiet inspiration for the small acts of daily defiance and the larger rebellions that were to come. Years later, as the nation tore itself apart in the crucible of the Civil War, the story of Belle Rêve became a footnote, a local curiosity eclipsed by the grand, bloody narrative of history. The official records, sealed and stored in a dusty courthouse, confirmed only the accidental deaths. But history is more than what is written down by the victors. Decades after the war, a collection of letters was discovered in the attic of a house in Philadelphia. They were from a man named Samuel, a successful carpenter and a leader in his community of freedmen, written to his wife, Alara. The letters spoke of a shared past, of a debt that could never be repaid, and of a night of terrible justice that had purchased their future. They confirmed what the whispers in the quarters had always known. Alara had eventually sold Belle Rêve, using the immense fortune to secretly fund abolitionist causes and establish schools for freed slaves. She had joined Samuel in the North, shedding her name and her past, living a quiet life far from the world of her birth. Her personal act of rebellion, born of love and desperation, was thus connected to the great, sweeping tide of history, a single, powerful current in the river of emancipation. In the final analysis, the story of Marcus Thorne is a chilling and profound meditation on the nature of justice. In a world where law and morality were inverted, where the institutions of power existed to protect the oppressor and punish the oppressed, what was a righteous act? Her deed was a cold-blooded, multiple murder. It was also, in the context of her world, an act of profound and necessary justice. She did not simply lash out in a fit of passion, she judged, condemned, and executed the architects of a system of relentless, daily atrocity. She used the master's tools of calculation, patience, and methodical planning to dismantle the master's house from within. The final, somber reflection rests on the power of memory and witness. The official history, written in the ledgers of men like Marcus Thorne, is a tale of profits, property, and power. But the true history, the human history, lives in the stories of the silenced, in the legends of the oppressed, and in the quiet, unyielding memory of those who survived. It reminds us that power built on cruelty is a fragile edifice, and that even in the darkest of times, the powerless hold the ultimate weapon, the truth. As an old saying from the quarters of Belle Rêve went, a saying that was born on that stormy night in 1858. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete.